for last week, which was postponed because of inclement weather. And also, you're missing the Olympics.
We're taking it.
You're taking it. All right, so I mean, it's now the figure skating or the skiing or what have you. So we'll make it on time. You'll get home. You're across the street. You won't miss a thing. All right.
It started at 7 o'clock. So
It started at 7 o'clock, and the Americans have already done pretty well.
Yeah.
Not bad.
Don't tell me because I haven't watched it.
Okay. So I'm going to tap Malka.
By the way, they rerun it at 12 o'clock at night.
Well, that's my best time.
Just in case, Ruth. We take that one too. Just in case.
This is too much for Dad.
And then I have some work. What?
You're making some work.
I know. What else is new?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have some articles here. Did you, those of you who signed up to get the electronic copies of the articles some time ago, did you get them?
Yeah.
Because I sent them. All right, so if you didn't get it, let me know and I'll resend it. But I have some other articles which I think are interesting. Tonight we're coming finally to American politics and the Jewish question, all right? So I'm going to pass around some things. One article is on the Americanization of Zionism, which I think is a very interesting article. And then I have something on the history of Jews in America, which I found very interesting. Also, it's kind of the curriculum for teachers. You might be interested in that. And then also from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Are American Jews Becoming Republican? Insights into Jewish Political Behavior. This is a dated article, but it's still very interesting. It's from 2003. So I'm going to pass, Malka, you're the,
Was it mine, your
Yeah.
secretary? With
I'll
pleasure,
start
with
you over
pleasure,
here,
with
all right?
pleasure, anytime.
All right, so if you want that, just sign on to it, and I will get it to you.
Excuse me, what are we signing?
Whether you want those articles electronically, okay? Got it? Rabbi, do I need this? No. All right, so let me just recoup a little bit quickly what we have done so you get the logic of my argument. I hope you'll think it's logical. And that is the first session we were looking at American exceptionalism, what makes America different. And the major argument there was that our entire political tradition is lodged in the Enlightenment paradigm, which means belief in rational thinking, progress, all good things, etc. And that led us then into an examination of the American Declaration of Independence, which is a vision of America. And I termed that our concept of America, this vision which will never be implemented on this earth, I don't think. But at least it remains a goal, it remains a goad, if you will, for government. And then the mechanics to implement this vision, which is a constitution. How do you take things like all men are created equal, protection of the law, etc., and how do you translate that into a workable government? So the vision is symbolized more or less by Thomas Jefferson, the Constitution more or less by James Madison. And the Constitution, I say, is the United States. So there is a certain tension between these two because it's the practical, everyday mechanics of governing versus the vision, trying to incorporate the vision. That was our first session. The second session had to do with, well, what happens if you feel in the mechanics of government that the majority didn't execute the law correctly? They misconceived the law. The majority is wrong. And so we looked at civil disobedience, the force of conscience, individual conscience, over law, over government, basically. And this is a very controversial concept in the American tradition. Basically, when you break the law, you're a criminal. Let's face it. And here we're saying you can break the law in the name of your conscience, the proviso being that you accept the penalty of the law. Otherwise, it becomes what we also looked at, radical disobedience, in which the 60s people were saying, we will break the law because we find the whole system illegitimate, and we want amnesty for breaking it. So that's a whole different kettle of fish. But the civil disobedience says we accept the system not only as legitimate, the majority as well-meaning, but in this case, misinformed. So the problematic here is conscience. How do you know, if somebody says it's against my conscience to pay my taxes for a Mexican war, which is exactly what Thoreau do, how do you know it's his conscience, or he just doesn't, he's tight, he doesn't want to pay the money? So it's important that you add that proviso, you have to accept the penalty for breaking the law. All right, otherwise you have no other recourse, shall we say, approving that. And the problem with civil disobedience came in the 1970s with the civil rights movement because under the impact of Gandhi, civil disobedience is transformed from a private act into a mass act. So then you have civil disobedience becoming a means of social change, and that of course can be quite, what should I say, disruptive of the entire system. So we have it's a very delicate subject and a very delicate practice. All right, so today's problematic, keeping in line with this, exceptional America and then going into civil disobedience, today's problematic is the problem of the public good. Now, the American vision is a Lockean vision, John Locke. So it is founded on the idea of the pursuit of self-interest. We're not going to go into the problems there. Do all of us, you know, we're supposed to be pursuing our own self-interest. Do all of us have an idea as to what our self-interest is? I sure don't. You know, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I stay here? Should I stay there? But our democratic system is founded on the idea that we should have the liberty to pursue whatever we think is in our self-interest. And of course, the capitalist system is very much in line with that. Free markets, free entrepreneurship, etc., etc. And what we see here is, again, in the American doctrine, this emphasis on individualism. Now, if you looked at the article that I sent to you, I think I sent to you electronically. I hope I didn't. If I didn't, I will. And that was the translation of the Declaration of Independence into Hebrew. The problem translating the English, in this case the American understanding of the English word people, into the Hebrew Hebrew Am has a collective connotation. The English American doctrine people has an individualistic connotation, right? We, the people of the United States, it's a concept that is many different individuals kind of get aggregated together, as we say, to form a collective. It's not a sense of a collective having common bonds, some kind of tradition, some kind of, shall we say, personality. And so within this American idea of peoplehood, which is very individualistic, then what do we mean by the public? And what do we mean by the public good? In line with that, what do we mean also by social justice? So, to look at Bentham, now Bentham was not an American, but he was in line with this liberal tradition. And Jeremy Bentham was what we call a utilitarian. So Jeremy Bentham said, well, in a democratic state, the public good is the greatest good for the greatest number. That looks easy. You just add it all up. What's good for you, good for you, good for you, good for you. You add it all up with the greatest good for the greatest number. That gets into the problem, however, of what about that minority? And also, can you just summarily calculate a good in that way? John Stuart Mill took issue with Bentham and said, well, it's not only the greatest good for the greatest number. Let's look at it a different way. He interjected what he termed a harm principle. Let's say the public good is that which does the least harm to the least number of people. Yeah, so now you can get into all kinds of problems with that. So, for example, the United States is an immigrant country. Yikes. We've got people coming from all different kinds of cultures with all different concepts of what constitutes the good and what constitutes harm, right? So, for example, just to give you an instance of what this means in our country, and no comments, please, when I say this, but I get my hair cut by a fellow newly emigrated from China. He's right here in Johnson Avenue. Every morning, he takes his children, his 2 children, from the Bronx, where he lives, down to Chinatown to go to school.
The Chinese school?
The Chinese school, right? Okay? They learn Chinese, they learn Chinese tradition, they learn Chinese ways, etc., etc. And so he perpetuates, as best he can, the Chinese culture within America. What he considers to be good and bad, because we have many conversations while he's cutting my hair, but, you know, on what he considers to be great and what he considers to be not so great. And it's not always in line with what I have in mind, and I think probably many other, let's say, born Americans. So we're an immigrant country. And what does this mean? And you have to contrast this to countries where the national identity is really identified with an ethnic group. Some would term this, I don't like this term, but I'm going to give it to you because it's used in ethnocracy. And incidentally, Israel is using that term and it makes me shudder because this is not a comfortable term that they should be using. But that's another story.
What does that mean?
Ethnocracy
And why
means
is it
the
pejorative?
rule of the ethnic group.
Rule of the ethnic.
Rule of the ethnic group. It was a term that the French nationalism was a liberal nationalism. It pertained pertained basically to the third estate, but it said everybody could be involved in it. And in contradistinction to that, the fascists of Europe talked about ethnocracy, that nationalism is identified with an ethnic group. So it's a dangerous term to use, but that's another whole topic here. When it comes to the United States, we have this idea of a pluribus unum, which I'm going to come back to, the one from the many. With the idea, however, it used to be that when I was growing up and went to school, we talked about American national identity is a melting pot. We don't talk about that anymore. American national identity is a mixed salad. All right? And the difference here, melting pot implies that some of the differences, etc., are melted down. The mixed salad implies that you're keeping your identity, right? And somehow that we all come together on a higher level that we then call an American. Boy, that's a complicated identity, right? And I don't know anybody, any other state that has this kind of really complicated, even the Russians. I mean, the Russians went for Russification, sending Russians into the Baltics and into the Stan republics, etc., in order to make it a much more Russified entity. All right, well, Louis Brandeis, I'm sure you've heard the name, and he's in part of your handout here. Brandeis, we can credit him with really articulating what American identity means, because what Brandeis does is to counter the idea, for example, that Jews and particularly Zionists are going to be guilty of dual loyalties. Now that was an argument that you saw all the time in Europe, right? You know, Jews had a loyalty to their own cultural background that they couldn't be loyal, I don't care, to Germany or to France or to wherever they were, all right? So Brandeis argues very convincingly, forcefully, that within a democracy one can have multiple loyalties. And think about how many loyalties you have in your own life. You have a loyalty to your family, you have a loyalty to your religious background, you have a loyalty to your community, you have a loyalty to friends, you maybe have a loyalty to people outside the United States that you know or are related to you, whatever the case is. So his argument was that the multiple loyalties are not the problem. The problem is only if loyalties are anti-democratic. So multiple loyalties that are loyal to democratic principles, namely freedom of exchange, freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, etc., do not present any kind of a problem to the state, to the democratic state. So I've got Brandeis' statement there for you, because if you haven't read it, it's very important to read. So what we then see is something terribly important, that the American system develops this very sophisticated, I would say quite psychologically quite complicated from the standpoint of politics, system in which a pluribus unum means, yes, a mixed salad, where you can maintain your own identity. My Chinese hairdresser can send his children to the Chinese school, no problem. I teach at Yeshiva University, no problem. All right? And we can all be Americans. You want to do it now? Can I finish? That's okay.
I'm Brandeis before you pass.
What?
I was going to ask before you pass
Okay.
Brandeis by.
Yes.
Is your reading then that the reason why, he said, the reason why there can't be dual loyalty to a democratic society is because democratic society is defined by whatever the majority determines it to be?
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, his understanding of multiple loyalties is that that's no problem from a democratic point of view, as long as these multiple loyalties are compatible with democratic values like freedom. I mean, if you have a multiple loyalty to a fascist, movement, then it's going to be problematic. No, so from that point of view. All right, so what we see in the American system, therefore, is a very complicated, sophisticated, I would say sophisticated, that's editorial maybe, idea of complicated loyalties that are not simply defined by the state and its culture. All right, so then the question becomes even more complex than what is that common good? We have many people from many different backgrounds, many different loyalties, so then what is the common good? And I'm going to just briefly introduce two people that are very, very special in my lexicon here. One is Michael Walzer. And if you haven't heard of these people, I hope you will, look them up. Michael Walzer is at Princeton. And he's done a lot of work in Jewish political theory, but he does a lot of work in American political theory. And I'll just tell you a little story about him because he wrote a book on just and unjust war. And I was having students of mine read that book, and I invited Walzer to come and talk to us about the book. And I said to him, I have to ask you an indelicate question, like what would be your honorarium? How much money do you want? And he looked at me and he said, to come and speak to students, I don't charge anything. So that shows you the caliber of individual that he is. And he writes that liberalism, even at its most permissive, is a hard politics because it offers so few emotional rewards. The liberal state is not a home for its citizens. It lacks warmth and intimacy. And so contemporary dissatisfaction takes the form of a yearning for political community, passionate affirmation, explicit patriotism. These are dangerous desires, for they cannot readily be met within the world of liberalism. Liberalism, he doesn't mean in terms of the party structures. He means a liberal democracy, all right? They leave us open to a politics I would find unattractive and even frightening. A willful effort to build social cohesion and political enthusiasm from above. Through the use of state power. Everybody understand what he's saying? Anybody want to put it in his own words? Liberalism is kind of lonely. We're talking about everybody free to do whatever he wants to do. What does it mean when he says it's a world with few emotional rewards, the lack of community?
Norms, societal norms are somehow they're so marginal to people's lives that they don't have to conform.
Yeah.
And I think conformity is what leads to community.
Okay, very often when you're seeing, for example, attempts at some kind of dictatorial government, you often find it couched in the terms of trying to build talking about the pursuit of self-interest, peoples or peoplehood, very individualistic, and Walter is saying that can be a kind of a lonely political environment. It can be a kind of a search for, or a yearning for a sense of community. So let me bring the other person. That's Michael Sandel of Harvard. And you have in your handout, first of all, a little biographical thing about him, an interview, and then also he interviewed the Chief Rabbi of England, Jonathan Sachs. So I put that in just as an interest for you. Sandel, if you're interested in him and pursuing him further, you go to YouTube, you can get his course on justice that he gives at Harvard. It is the most subscribed course probably in the history of this country and maybe of the world. Some have called him the most popular professor that has ever lived, because his course in justice is tremendous, and look what the title of this book is, right? Justice. So here he argues that some consider public engagement with questions of the good life to be a civic transgression, a journey beyond the bounds of liberal public reason, taking the opposite tack of Walzer. Incidentally, Sandel he calls himself a traditionalist. Politics and law should not become entangled in moral and religious disputes. We often think for such entanglement opens the way to coercion and intolerance. Watch out if the state is going to start getting involved in community building, then we might be in for trouble. This is a legitimate worry. Citizens of pluralist societies, which we are, do disagree about morality and religion, even if, as I've argued, it's not possible for government to be neutral on these disagreements. Is it nonetheless possible to conduct our politics on the basis of mutual respect? The answer, I think, is yes. But we need a more robust and engaged civic life than the one to which we've become accustomed. In recent decades, we've come to assume that respecting our fellow citizens' moral and religious convictions means ignoring them, for political purposes at least, leaving them undisturbed and conducting our public life insofar as possible without reference to them. So Sandel's point here is that we should be much more concerned not only with entering into civic participation, which I think probably everyone would agree on, but also that we should begin to define much more closely as a society what the public good is. And Walter is saying the minute you begin to talk about defining that public good, it becomes constricting, constraining, right? So two very different ideas here. And I'm going to take this kind of a position, and that is that, and I throw it out to you for your conversation, that I think the United States has selected a very unique way to define the public good, and that is through interest group negotiation with government. Now, that's...
You mean lobbies?
Lobbies. That's a problematic statement. We see, for example, that in European states, lobbies do not play, interest groups play the same role that they play in the United States. France is often called, the term is, it's an official term, an neo-corporatist state, meaning that the central government chooses those interest groups that it wants to negotiate with in terms of public policy. The others fall by the wayside. In the United States, the negative of the situation that we have is that we are increasingly being called an interest group democracy. Every little group, if it gets, enough money, and doesn't even have to have so many adherents, it just has to have a lot of money to make an impact, but it can lobby Congress. So the active interest groups in this country are problematic. However, they allow the various sections of our very complicated immigrant, what do we want to call it, pluralistic society to express their own interests as to what will be the common good. And let me just build up that argument a minute and say you can't think of the common good as Bentham did, kind of arithmetically. You're just going to add it up. This is your interest, that's your interest, that's your interest. You're going to bottom line tally it, and this will be the public good. So, for example, let me give you this illustration. The Electoral College is a weighted, indirect system of choosing the American presidency. There have been those who would like to get rid of the Electoral College and say every American citizen, voting citizen, should be able to vote for president. You know what would be the impact of that for a standpoint of Jews? The Jewish vote would lose its clout. Anybody want to say why?
It would be absorbed into,
They're concentrating in.
in a few places.
Terrific, because the Jewish vote is concentrated, the Electoral College has a weighted vote according to the states with the largest population, biggest cities. So if you think Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, etc., that is where Jewish vote has its concentration as well. All right? So the Electoral College, the way it operates, allows the Jewish vote to have an impact, which it otherwise wouldn't have if it were one man, one vote. Some of you may know that the Supreme Court in 62, 64 went into what were called the reapportionment cases against gerrymandering of districts. In other words, where districts were drawn irregularly to give favor to one party over another party. All right, so the Supreme Court finally got into that issue, and the upshot was now that every 10 years we have to, according to the census, reapportion the districts. Maybe some of you are aware of the fact that the Hasidim down in Williamsburg have argued, the redistricting means that the Hasidic community is often divided. Part of it ends up in a non-Hasidic district, and the other part of it is in its own district. And therefore its vote is, shall we say, watered down, the effect of its vote. Okay, so Edmund Burke, who was an Englishman at the time of the French Revolution in the British Parliament, took issue with the French on this very issue because the French wanted to also have this kind of reapportionment. One man, one vote. Everybody should be considered as an interest in and of himself. And so everyone should be equal on that score. And Burke raises the point that some minority interests are so vital to the public good that they need to be quote-unquote protected. Is everybody following me? That you can't just have it as an arithmetic
Does France have the same
summation?
system? Does France have a similar system to the electoral vote? Is that
No, no, but at the time of the revolution, what they wanted to do was to make this kind of change.
Uh-huh.
And Burke was arguing this is a kind of a geometric way of looking at politics. So the argument here was that, let me give you an example from the United States. Some of you may remember the administration of LBJ Johnson. And one of the things that LBJ had as part of his platform was the protection of the family farm in America. You can say, why should we protect the family farm? Anyone want to venture on that? Say we should give subsidies to the family farm so we keep it alive. Why? We have Garst of Iowa, who's the big, agro-industrialist. What do you need a family farm for? Anybody want to venture? Malta venture.
It's like American Heritage.
American Heritage. Thomas Jefferson, remember Thomas Jefferson had said the farmer is the self-reliant person and therefore the stalwart supporter of democracy. He's, he thinks rationally because he's not dependent on anybody. So the idea here was that the family farm was not only part of the heritage, but it was a part of the vision that we talked about, that American vision. So what I'm trying to say in a very cursory fashion right now is that the public good sometimes means you have to have special protection for minority interests or smaller interests that are vital to the overall complexion.
But wasn't it also true that in Jefferson's time, you couldn't vote unless you owned land?
Yeah.
With all the democracy,
Yeah. No, 100%.
people who didn't own land couldn't vote.
100%.
So that is more support for the landowners.
Yeah. But,
It's not so
but
democratic, by the way.
well,
It's
yeah.
not
I mean,
100%
Martha, you're
democratic.
on that score, certainly you're right. But the argument here was the notion that there was an American endemic initial fear of urban life.
Well, Jefferson was
Because
for that.
because the idea was if you're a city dweller, you're dependent. And if you're dependent, you work for somebody, you're not working for yourself on the farm, you're not the independent landowner. There was the other idea that cities tend to be subject to demagoguery and you get a lot of mass movements and what have you, and that therefore democracy would be very unstable, tenuous, however you want to look at it. So that was an early prejudice. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that you can't just add up people without reference to their backgrounds in terms of the public good. That's what the American system basically came to recognize. And that brings us to the Jewish vote. Why? There was a book that came out in 2007 by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt on, you know it?
We know who
The
they are.
Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy.
Exactly.
In which these two, Walt was at Harvard, Kennedy School, and Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago. The basic argument was that not only is American foreign policy tied up by AIPAC and what they term the Jewish lobby, but it's tied up in a way which is contrary to American national interests. Now this book got a lot of flack from academic community and certainly also from Jewish organizations. It got a claim otherwise, as you can imagine. But you know, what does that book have to do with what we're saying? Do you think? What are we trying to bring out? What is AIPAC? What is the Jewish lobby?
The subject we touched on before about dual loyalty.
All right, that certainly figures into it.
It figures into it.
I mean, from the standpoint of this book you're talking about, Mearsheimer and Walt.
And in general,
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, Israel represents has a lot of the same values. I mean, we're always talking about the commonalities between American,
100%.
it's not necessarily the same government structure,
100%.
but the concepts of democracy, even if they're, and I don't know how differently they're applied. I mean, everybody, each country has their own way of doing whatever they do. But the commonality allows an organization like AIPAC to promote itself as a legitimate organization.
100%. Why you need it? You're absolutely right. Just kind of
No,
follow
but
follow my logic through, if you think it's logical.
Right, that is good.
How is the American public good defined? Is there some force out there in the American government that says this is the American public good? How is it defined? It's defined by the rank and file population, right? And what is the rank and file American population? Immigrant groups, different groups, diverse groups, right? So the American definition, the process of defining what it is that is the American national interest or public good or what have you, is a process of negotiation on the part of the individual interests that comprise the American society with governmental figures. Do I make myself clear? You understand what I'm saying? Okay.
you know, right?
Yeah.
What we see today, talking about public good,
Yeah.
what we see today in Congress, it's very hard to tell what is public good.
That's certainly true. I mean,
That's the situation today.
if you go back to Walther will argue that the liberal democratic state really never should have a well-defined public good. Why not? And that's the point I'm trying to make. Why shouldn't we have a well-defined? Why shouldn't government say this is our public good?
Because it's limiting.
Not only limiting, what is it?
It's coercive.
It's coercive. It's coercive. So the concept of the American public good at any one moment in time is a result of what? It's the result of you and me.
You're saying that if everybody actually agreed on the same thing, if there was,
The American process is a negotiation process.
in other words, the tension is important.
Yeah. And the point is that different groups, in this case, go to Washington, they could go to the state, to negotiate what the interest is going to be at that particular moment. So the Mearsheimer book is outrageous for what reason? It may make you mad because, gee, he says things that aren't even correct, but as a hypothesis, why is it offbeat?
The whole notion of realist foreign policy, that there is one good out there that a state should be and that's the reason why.
Number one, and everybody does that. Why just look at AIPAC? That's what the American system is all about, right? You understand what I'm saying? That's how the United States works. That's how we define what it is that's going to be the public good and basically what is going to be foreign policy, etc. So the process here is one of constant negotiation, and this is why Sandel argues we should be much more civically engaged than we are. How come? If you're not civically engaged, what happens to the concept of the public good and the actualization of it?
Falls away.
Somebody else will
You're not
define
allowed
it.
to define
Somebody
it.
else will define it.
Right.
It's just that simple,
Nature of going.
right?
Well, that's what's so empowering about
Yes.
going to Washington on one of these missions, is that you feel like you are taking your perspective, what you feel is good for America vis-a-vis whatever you're presenting.
Yeah.
And, I mean, other people might be coming the same day to see the same people with their perception of what they think is good for America from their perspective and from their expressing their need within that perspective. So it's a very engaging experience to do that.
100%.
It's very empowering,
The shul
actually.
is now part of it, APEC.
Right.
Venture, right? Yeah.
And
And students who go down there are just, I can't even express to you how marvelous they feel once they've come back. They feel they've done
It's
something.
empowering.
It's empowering, they've done something, all right? So this is the position of Sandel. You know, you've gotta get out there, because that's how the system works. Because nobody's defining it from above, it's defined by the separate interests. This is a pluralist country
I did
with
that
no,
today. I went to Albany today,
a fantastic,
and I
Mazel
lobbied for more money for early childhood. in
Ah,
With about
fantastic,
200 other people.
wow, fantastic.
So
All
I
right.
felt empowered.
Well,
Spoke
and
to
look,
our local
Klein in
congressmen,
the state
our local
legislature,
assemblymen.
did you read about that, has just, I think he got the bill passed, that any university that sends people to, for example, the American, what is that, AMA
Oh,
Association? The
American
one that-
Studies
The
Association.
American, what is it?
Studies, American Studies
No,
Association.
but,
That's about the
With the
boycott.
BDS?
no, the one that, the boycott of Israel.
Yeah.
It was
American
the
Studies.
ASA, I thought it was
ASA.
AMA, was it
No,
ASA?
ASA.
Okay.
American
Um,
Studies.
Yeah, all right, so any school that participates in that won't get state money. Why should the state money go into a boycott of Israel? But you can't fight that unless you go to Albany. You understand the point I'm trying to make? All right. So,
Isn't the
so
basis
this,
academic
I
freedom?
mean, look, Margaret, just, I'll get to you one second. Let me just say that this is why the early founders were always, you have to be vigilant. Democracy is vigilant. If you're not vigilant, somebody else will come in and take over. All right, so it requires civic participation. That's Sandel's point. Go ahead.
About the boycott, about the universities, I thought that the basis for America to get involved, the American universities,
Yeah.
government, was a basis of academic freedom.
Which,
Was it not so much Israel, but to have academic freedom
oh,
in
100%.
universities?
100%, but Klein, acting as a legislator,
Right.
is going to say, why should we give money for somebody who's gonna go into this boycott? It's it's anti-our values, all right?
Uh-huh.
Now, one other thing, look at our time, one other thing. Yes, I'm sorry,
Isn't this the difference between the melting pot
and the salad, yes. Very good, yeah. It's 100% true. Now, I've been reading that many Europeans can't understand the special relationship between the United States and Israel. Somebody explain it to us. I hope it's by now somewhat clear. I was at maybe about 5 years ago, I went down to Washington group of journalists of the Jewish book series, whatever it was, number of Jewish journalists down there, and they said, you know, there would have to be some catastrophe to dislodge Congress from Israel. Why?
Because it's a nation that shares our values.
100%, and what else? You know, I entitled this The American Political Imagination. And Israel shares that imagination. And what is that?
The fresh start.
Fresh start,
Well, that optimistic,
optimistic, kind of
upbeat.
enlightenment kind of thing. Frontier, the frontiersman, right? Anything else you want to add on that?
Can we just admit that we've been successful at placing Israel at the center of American foreign policy? To your point that everyone does that.
Well, you know, I mean, I
democracy,
think
we've been
that's
successful.
true, Jason, I think it's true, but Walter will say, America is Hebraic and puritanic. What do you think he means by that?
They were the new Israel.
They were the new Israel. They were the new Israel. You probably didn't register with you. People like Madison spoke Hebrew, fluent Hebrew. Right? So there's a interesting bond. There's a cultural bond. There's an imaginative political bond that unites these two. So
Are you saying this is historical from the beginning
yeah,
of
yeah. Yes.
the early fathers had
Yes.
a sense of
And
respect
I mean, I don't want to draw this maybe too extremely, but if you look at the history of the United States from the time of Chaim Solomon, you have Jews a part of the American experience. Jews are never just the newcomers to the society. Jews are a part of the American experience from day one. You know, I'll send you the articles, inspiring to read. And so there is this this kind of interesting what do I want to call it? Not osmosis.
evolution.
Yeah, the what?
Evolution.
Well, it's more than that. It's like the United States and the Jewish community grow up together. And there's a stake for Jews in America. You know, without question. So the last thing I wanted to look at here, and our time is so short, and I'm sorry because this is a big issue, is the Jewish vote. Because the Jewish vote from the time of Roosevelt, when Jews go into the Democratic Party, we don't have time to go into that. Before that, they had been partially in the Republican Party with Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, exactly. And then switch in terms of the Roosevelt era. And now we see, I know from the standpoint of, let's say, the Nixon years and Reagan years, the Jewish vote began to get into the Republican camp. And I know my husband was one of the ones that was going out day in, day out to solicit the vote for the Republicans and for Israel. So that's a nonpartisan, editorial remark. But the Jewish vote now stands about 70% Democratic, 30% Republican. And you'll see it on, I gave you a sheet for how the Jews have voted through the years. So the question is, a Jewish vote that splits, and it's now basically the Orthodox community that's splitting off. So what does that mean in terms of the overall efficacy of Jewish negotiation power in terms of the United States?
We're losing.
I believe
It's done.
And what do you think you can do about it. Can one do anything about that in terms of, Jason?
Well, there's a plus minus to it, isn't there, right?
Yeah.
Because if Republicans never, if you can't win the vote, then you don't negotiate for the vote, right? So if let's say the Jewish vote was consistently 90% Democratic, then you wouldn't get negotiation from Republican politicians on the issue. But if you can win the vote, then you negotiate for the vote.
Yeah.
So if the Jewish vote is open, then you get courted for it. So there's a benefit to the fact that
That's true.
It's
That's true.
seen as if the Jewish vote
Yes.
is.
You remember James Baker?
Yeah, this is true.
Right.
And, it's in line also with the Pew Report, which you had a series on, because if, as Jews get more and more Jews get more and more assimilated into the American scene and don't necessarily, I don't want to say they don't identify themselves Jewishly, but they may not identify themselves religiously, right? So then what do you think that will mean politically?
One of the reasons that the Hasidim had such power, because they block voted.
Yeah, see, this is it. And which is why the reapportionment was so hit them hard. Anybody?
I think that I'm a little puzzling over it. If all these special interests are lobbying the government, in a sense, they're trying to get the common good. They're
Yeah.
trying to get their idea to be part of the
Their
common good,
idea of the
which
common
is
good.
against what we say that there is a national
Well-
common good coming down from the government. But in a sense, we're trying to influence.
Yeah,
I don't know, not necessarily the Jewish lobby, but other, any.
I mean, this is how our system works. Some would say we've gone overboard, the lobbies are too powerful. You can have very small lobbies that are, however, very wealthy, and they have a lot of resources, and they carry a lot of clout. I mean, the common one, and I hate to be so common on it, is the gun lobby.
Right.
It used to be the AMA. They always used to say, well, look at the AMA, it's so important. And now, poor AMA, with Obamacare and everything else, where did it go? But, I mean, this is how Americans do things. If you take Americans out of the country and you put them in a foreign environment and they have a dispute, they're going to negotiate this way. I need this and you need that, and we're going to, that's the pragmatic compromising kind of techniques that we've all been somehow taught. But you're right. I mean, it's not a clean way of defining the public good. But anything else, if you follow Michael Walzer or Michael Sandel, anything else smacks of imposition and, as you said, coercion.
But one thing that happens is that if the people who are lobbying don't have some basic interest
Yeah,
in what you're saying, the lobbying doesn't work.
that's
And also-
a very good point.
And also, when
That's
they,
a
when
very
they go
good
back
point.
to their constituency,
Yeah,
if those things aren't favorable to the constituency,
Yeah.
then they get voted out of office or condemned.
this is very, very true. I have a friend who said, asked this question, I wish I had an answer. Why is it that the system doesn't produce better candidates for leadership?
It's very
Yeah,
expensive
because I
to
think
run
that's
for office.
where, yeah,
Part
I
of it
think
is
it
the
is
money.
too.
It takes a lot of money now. to
Yeah.
run for
And
office, and
that's
it's very
probably
destructive of their
The
family.
seed of the problem, right? Because to come back to your point, which is a wonderful point, if you had more astute leaders, then the lobbying would take a different format.
Well, sometimes I think lobbying requires doing basic education with
Yeah.
whoever you're sitting with, because there are the multitude of issues that the representatives in Congress, whether they're senators or, in the House, they're expected to make decisions about things, it would really be very difficult to know everything about everything. So they really need to rely on, I think, people to feed in, hopefully, correct information so that they can make, you
This
know,
is
a proper
100%
decision.
right.
I-
100% right.
Actually, most of the
Yeah.
legislation is written by the aides.
Yes,
The aides
Because
and
they
the
know,
lobbies.
they know what's
Yes.
going on. They rely on those aides.
I mean, this is,
Their specialties.
you know, I mean, as I mentioned the first time around, you know, I am embarrassed to say of myself, I don't know 1/10 of the laws that are coming out of Congress every year. I don't read those laws. I'm governed by laws. I have no idea what they say or what they cover.
Right.
Does anyone?
You
You
find
know,
out if you ever transgress one. you
Right.
find
Yeah.
out whether you ever-
Yeah,
Right.
so this is in a sense where government goes, I want to say over our head. You know, it's no longer controllable. And then the public good becomes even more problematic.
I think the vision that you presented of American politics is very coherent. I mean, it's compelling. Notion of groups lobbying for what the public good means. I think though then, right, not a critique per se, but a problem with that, or a problem that maybe even has solutions to, but is that sort of the Caroline products, but no forefront. That there are groups that are incoherent, groups that
Yeah.
aren't represented.
Yeah.
Right, that becomes the problem. So if the way you get power is by having a group and lobbying on behalf of your group, is having some hearings. So what if you don't have a group, right? So whatever this is maybe, but like, what if you're one of the X million people who are uninsured? How many?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
5 years ago,
Yeah.
right?
Definitely a problem.
So if politics in America is group
Definitely
politics,
a problem.
who defines
Yeah.
the group as and what if you're not part of the group?
Yeah,
or what if-
definitely a problem.
I think one of
Definitely.
the major problems is that you look at the value of the money that all the
Yeah.
people in government have, it sort of removes them from the common good.
Yeah. I mean, the money factor, not only the unorganized, but the passive. The system requires you to be active. That's the whole paradigm. You've got to be active, and so many people increasingly today, let's face it, we want to go home and watch the Olympics. Right? I mean, you don't want to think, oh God, they're going to go out and organize now. I mean, I hate to call it Mao Zedong, but he said, revolution is no tea party. You gotta get out there and do it all the time. Well, the same thing is with civic participation. You have to be there.
But look at the
Yeah.
election of President Obama, his
Yeah.
first election. He
Yeah.
was able to mobilize
Yes.
hundreds of thousands of young people that had not been involved in politics or inspired in so many years. And older people too.
Yeah, this is true.
I don't know that they would feel the same way with the second election.
No, yeah.
But, and what
Unfortunately.
happened to all that mobilization? Where did they go? They went back to their television sets? I don't know, where did they
I
go?
don't think there's
Yeah,
no
Goes to the parents' apartment,
failure of the vision. When he came into office, he presented a vision. And a lot of young people felt that that vision was different than what had been going on. They voted for the vision. I think that when they found out what happened in government after that, they got discouraged.
Yeah. And that, the millennial generation, as it's called, they're kind of, I want to say they're kind of recuperating from what was considered the previous passive generation. Because they, for some reason, maybe it was the 60s that knocked us all out of whack. We got really just depleted with everything that went on then. And then you have a generation that just withdrew. The Vietnam thing was traumatic. And so this millennial generation, I mean, look, I had a student come to me last year, my jaw dropped as he sat in my office and he said, blasely, I intend to run for president. I thought, my gosh, I remember the days of Beam, when Beam was elected mayor of New York City, and all around me people were saying, a Jewish mayor, and what if he does something wrong? What's going to happen to all of us? And now this young whippersnapper says, you know, I'm going to want to run for president, and I have an uncle who is telling me how to do it.
Well, Lieberman was very close.
Is
to that.
100%. So you have this generation that feels, what word would you give that?
Entitled.
Integrated. I didn't want to use the word entitled. That was almost on my lips, and I hate that word. I just
Very
hate
sorry.
it, you know. Everything is an entitlement. What does that mean, you know?
They can achieve whatever.
Yeah,
Right.
100%. This is it.
They're very-
They feel.
They're
They're-
very confident.
Yeah, they don't. They have confidence. They feel integrated. They feel confident. They feel that they have the liberated. That they have the abilities. And I could see this guy as president. And I said, man, I lived so long, you know. And maybe I'll get invited to tea at the White House. Who knows? But that's the, you know, slowly the shift, I think, that's coming in. But it's always generational. Maybe, and I hope this doesn't sound too far afield, but I think the death of Hoffman, I think, was really shocking for a lot of people. And the death of Hoffman is waking a lot of people up to the kind of street culture that we have. What's going on here? You know, is this the America that we want to have? And, you know, I have faith that those things create a discussion. Y'all know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Well, it comes about at the same time that marijuana is suddenly becoming available. And
Well, my students just in class last week were saying, we were talking about the need for rebellion, and so they argued that marijuana was great when it was an element of rebellion, but now you legalize it, so now you have to do something more, you know, fantastical or profound or what have you.
now they're putting it in chocolate.
In other words, there's a psychological environment in which we work too, and there have to be certain barriers so people know this they can't do, and then they can rebel against it, and everything's wonderful. But if there are no barriers, they keep pushing farther and farther on. And so that's I think they are becoming aware of that, and the need for some kind of authority. Oh gosh, authority. You know, during the Vietnam War, authority was a dirty word. Nobody talked about authority. Didn't want to. So I think it's a relapse that we'll get over. But the bottom line, what I'm really trying to leave you with is that think about the Jewish vote, think about getting out there, think about going with AIPAC to Washington. That's the American way. And it's everybody's right to push government, to try to get what it wants out of government, Mearsheimer Walt notwithstanding. All right, thank you very much.